Welcome back everybody to Neutrality Studies, tonight with a special episode because I have with me Felix Marquardt and the very famous Gabor Mate. But in fact, it wasn't me, it was Felix who interviewed Gabor, and we are broadcasting this interview here for you to watch because the two of them talked about this very important topic of accusations of anti-Semitism. And with this out of the way, Felix, I'll leave it up to you.
It's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to welcome Dr. Gabor Mate, world-renowned physician, specialist on trauma, addiction. Your work on how unhealed pain drives both individual and collective violence has never felt more relevant. Gabor, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be with you, Felix.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. In 1950, in his discourse on colonialism, Aimé Césaire argued that while Europeans claimed their horror was about what man had done to man, it was actually more about realizing that they had done to white Europeans what they had been doing to non-whites all around the world for 5 centuries. You survived the Holocaust as an infant, embraced Zionism, then changed your mind. Walk us through that journey and how you came to decide that never again had become a tribal slogan, and that Zionism weaponizes Jewish suffering to justify a classical colonial, settler colonial situation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a book I have on my shelf called Endless Holocaust, which is about the millions of people that the American empire has destroyed over the centuries. And there's a tendency to compartmentalize the genocide against Jews, which is horrible, of course. My grandparents fell victims to it, nearly did I as well as an infant. But it was only the latest of multiple, not the last, but at that time, the latest of multiple genocides. And Hitler, as a matter of fact, took as some of his models the way the Americans had treated their indigenous people. So we have to put this into context, number one. Number two, Zionism didn't begin by weaponizing the Holocaust because the Holocaust didn't exist yet. Zionism was a response to anti-Semitism in Europe, to European anti-Semitism, which was horrific enough even prior to the Nazi genocide. By the way, I really don't like that word Holocaust. You know what it means? Holocaust means a burnt sacrifice. It's a biblical term. What are we talking about? Genocide is the word. The Holocaust has become the accepted terminology. So Zionism began in response to European anti-Semitism, and along with other European nationalisms, it sought to locate its nationalistic aspirations in a particular land. The difference was that the European nationalisms, whether it's French or German or Italian, Risorgimento or Hungarian or Slovak, they did take place on lands occupied by those ethnic groups. Jews didn't envy such land, and so their nationalism had to be realized on a land that they claimed they had a right to because of ancient history, which itself is a interesting subject and historically entirely incorrect. We can talk about that. But nevertheless, they sought to establish Jewish nationhood in this ancient homeland. The problem being that there was already a people living there, and there was this totally dishonest slogan of a land without a people for a people without a land. But they knew very well that there was no land without a people, and within Jewish circles, there was huge debate about that. And some Zionists said, look, we can't do this because there's already people living there. And the Zionist leaders who became predominant said, yes, there's a people living there, and those people are going to fight against us, and we're going to have to destroy them. I mean, they talk about this very openly. This wasn't like retrospective. So insofar as Jewish pain is concerned, certainly some of that flowed into the Zionist project. But at the same time, it was a nationalist project on European lines and necessarily a colonial project, because without Western imperial support, it could never have been achieved. So to summarize my answer here, I'm reluctant to ascribe everything that Israel has done or the West has done to kind of historical pain. There's always that element in there. I mean, the people that went to Australia from England were the lowest classes who'd been persecuted in England. So there was certainly pain there. But if you look at what Israel has done over the decades, it's no different than what every settler colonial project has ever done, which is to kill, displace, dispossess, rob, suppress, torment the indigenous populations to almost to the point of extinction in the case of Australia and North America and New Zealand. So it's a colonial project that certainly has an element of pain infused in it, but the pain doesn't explain the policies overall.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video.
What's fascinating about when you read the early Zionists and in the 20s and 30s, they or even sometimes before, it seems that it's almost like the ones who are the realists are those who are saying we're going to have to fight and we're going to have to kill.
Oh, they said that very openly. They said that in so many words, and even as late as 1956, Moshe Dayan, who was the one-eyed general, and a Zionist hero, gave a speech at the funeral of an Israeli soldier that had been killed by some Gazans. This is 1956. And he said, of course they hate us. They look across their fence and they see us tilling their lands and living in the villages that used to be theirs. Why wouldn't they hate us? And his, by the way, the first massacre of people in Gaza by Israel happened in 1956, where they lined up some civilians and just murdered them. And the kids who were watching that became leaders of Hamas decades later. So that, this is, if you know a bit of history, it's not all that mysterious. But yeah, they knew what they had to do, and the early Zionists, they weren't moralistic about it. They said, "Oh, it's not that the Arabs are evil. Of course they will oppose us. We're trying to take their land. In their position, we would do the same thing." They said that in so many words. Both Ben Gurion, the leader of the labor strain, and Jabotinsky, who funded the revisionist Zionists, which became Likud today. And by the way,
Yeah.
You asked about my own personal trajectory. My grandfather, who died in Auschwitz, was a friend of Jabotinsky's. And as for me, given the history of my own family and my near demise as an infant at the hands of the Nazis, Zionism made every sense in the world as to why we need our own country and our own army and our own homeland, where we're not minorities and despised and suppressed. But I knew what Palestinians. So when you ask me, how did they change their minds? Because I found out that they were Palestinians who had their own history. And I found out what we had to do to them in order to establish our own dreams. So the nightmare that we imposed on our Palestinians to achieve our dream. And once I became aware of that, and this is happening to a lot of people now. Just this morning, there was an article in the New Yorker magazine about a synagogue in New Jersey, where there's a huge division within the community. Because as people are finding out about the Palestinians, they lose their allegiance to Zionism. Because once you open that window and you look at what actually happened, you can't hold on. And, if you have an open heart and an open mind, you can't be a Zionist. To be a Zionist, you have to have a closed heart or a closed mind, at least one or the other. because once you find out about what was done over the decades and what is being done now to the Palestinians, you can't be a Zionist.
It's indeed. I mean, there's clearly a change, massive change taking place in hearts and minds, but it seems to be affecting the Jewish community far more in the U.S. than in Europe. I think only 37% of Jews in North America, or at least in the U.S., identify as Zionists, which is unheard of. Just a few years ago, that was absolutely not the case.
Yeah.
But I find there's two things that are happening that really strike me about this change in America and absence of change in Europe. It's first of all this difference itself, but also the fact that the change happening in America is absolutely not covered by media in Europe. It's as if governments and the Jewish community in Europe are trying to keep this secret. And I think like the question I had about that for you is it feels like it's the cultural equivalent of the need for, in an abusive relationship, the need for the bully or the abusive parent to shred everything in secrecy and to sort of hide, to do the abuse. And it seems like what is happening in Europe is we're trying to keep the conversation separate, knowingly, because we don't want to change a certain state of affairs in Europe about the conversation regarding Israel.
Yeah. So in America, according to the polls, as many Jews opposed Israel's actions in Gaza as supported it. It's not much reported, but it's reported in this morning New Yorker, for example. Now Europe is a bit different. America is a settler colonist country where settlers from Europe came, they colonized the continent, and they almost succeeded, not quite, but almost, in totally exterminating the indigenous population. Europe are colonial countries. France is a major colonial country, the British, major colonial country. They all had their share in it. The Netherlands, a colonial country. I don't know if you realize this, but after the Second World War, the Dutch killed nearly 300,000 Indonesians as a way of holding on to their colony, which they didn't succeed. But Italy and its horrendously murderous campaigns in Africa, Ethiopia, France, it's, what can I say, brutal colonial history in North Africa. And in France, let's not forget, was it 1967 or 68? How many Algerians were killed in France, in Paris, by the police and thrown into the Seine?
61.
Yeah. Okay. So that history is very fresh, and Europe has never surrendered its colonial, never acknowledged its colonial now the Germans, the first genocide they committed wasn't against Jews. It was against the Harari in what is now Namibia, I think, in the early 20th century. They barely ever, barely ever talk about that. So that when Europe lines up with the Zionist project, they're really lining up with themselves, including their present. It's more neo-colonial than directly colonial now, but France, until recent history, very frequently sent troops into Africa to buttress this or that government, which served its interests. So for them, the Zionist project makes every sense in the world because it's what they do and what they've always done. So it's a colonial identification. Now, as far as the Jewish community in Europe is concerned, I tell you, I was in Auschwitz for the first time last May. And I went there to give a 5-city tour of Poland to talk about Palestine. And my host took me to Auschwitz, and it was a very moving, deeply moving experience. And I stood at the very spot in Birkenau where my grandparents would have got off the train and to be sent immediately to the gas chambers, and where my mother and I nearly ended up as well. And when we came out of Birkenau, they asked me, "What are your thoughts?" And my first thought was that those of my fellow Jews who continue to identify with Auschwitz as being, which is beyond horrible. I mean, there's nothing like Auschwitz in the history of the world. And those are my fellow Jews who identify with the Auschwitz, where their identity is based on that victimhood. They'll never understand the Palestinians. Because from the point of view of victimhood, you're always the victim. And therefore, anything that's done to you is victimhood, and everything that you do is self-defense. But it's not just victimhood, it's also an entitled victimhood. So that we're victims, therefore we're entitled to do whatever we want. And that's the mentality of the Jewish communities in Europe. So that in Amsterdam last year, when these soccer hooligans from the Maccabi team go around beating up Arab taxi drivers and pulling down Palestinian flags and fomenting violence, they are the victims when the people fight back.
Mhm.
It's an entitled victimhood. And it has a cocoon inside the West colonial mentality. So that entitled victimhood is coddled and supported by the colonialist mentality. And France has been miserably dishonest about confronting its own colonial history. Why would it look honestly at Zionism?
Of course, there's a need in France to. France is constantly, its whole conversation about Israel is informed by its refusal to look at its role in World War II,
Yeah.
and to recognize, for instance, to just give one instance of a French colonial disaster, to recognize that in a way, French Algeria is an Israel that failed.
Yeah.
So that really definitely resonates. The same way that
No, you go ahead.
the same way that there's this sort of active effort to disconnect the conversation between both sides of the Atlantic. The French, I feel in France, we're weaponizing anti-Semitism constantly, but we're also weaponizing linguistic barriers and cultural barriers. And again, I'm sort of want to go back to this idea, if it resonates with you, of you know how a bully in the schoolyard will sort of hide behind a bush to beat the bullied kid up, and like it seems that there's something going on in France where there's a concerted, and this is not even just French. It seems like it's a concerted effort of Western governments to pretend that resistance movements, whether high intensity movements that are, fighting directly against Israel or the U.S.
Mhm.
and Western powers, or low intensity movements which are happening all across Europe, that these movements are sort of fringe, that they're marginal, when actually the reality, and it's very obvious when you look at sort of the way people are behaving and talking, etc. It's the reality is that most people agree on the fact that ethno supremacism or religious supremacism is abhorrent. And so I'd be interested in, and again, sort of, what is that? What is happening here with this constant attempt to isolate people and making them believe that they are a fringe movement or a minority voice, or what's going on there?
Well, so first of all, this anti-Semitism issue. I know at least 8 Israeli Jewish scholars of genocide who have declared what Israel has done in Gaza as genocide. There was an article by 2 Hebrew University Jewish scholars in Haaretz newspaper a few months ago that said, there's no Auschwitz in Gaza, but there is genocide. So first of all, anybody that wants to claim, and a former reserve colonel in the general in the Israeli army said that the Israeli army uses Palestinian babies as target practice. And Israeli journalists regularly talk about Israel as an apartheid state. So the first point to make is, if anybody's going to claim anti-Semitism on the part of those who make their statements, let them first argue with those Jewish Israeli scholars who make these statements. So what are they talking about, anti-Semitism? So it's just a weaponization. Now, anti-Semitism has a horrendous history in France, going back to the Dreyfus affair, which is a huge stain on French history.
Yeah, which was a huge argument for the first Zionists, actually.
Yes, it was. And Herzl himself was shocked into Zionism by the Dreyfus affair, l'affaire Dreyfus, So, so there is a horrendous history of anti-Semitism, and we know very well how Vichy France collaborated with the Germans in the persecution and extermination of the Jews. So there's plenty of guilt there. And one way for them to, and for the Germans as well, one way to assuage that guilt is we're supporters of Israel, the Jewish state. So there's that. And who wants to be an anti-Semite, given the stained, horrendous history of that particular form of racial hatred? But ultimately, it's not about that. Ultimately, it's about the interests of these governments and these states. Germany was a major arms supplier to Israel. And Francesca Albanese, bless her soul, prepared this report showing all the involvement and profiteering of banks and weapons companies and all manner of Western corporations in the genocide, which again, if you don't like that word, talk to the Jewish Israeli scholars who are calling it that. Don't argue with me. I'm not a genocide scholar. Don't argue with people who use that phrase. Go argue with the Jewish Israeli scholars of Holocaust who are calling this genocide. But there's a huge Western economic investment. So it's not just about guilt, historical or otherwise. It's not just about defense against the charge of anti-Semitism. It's also naked imperial interest.
It's business.
It's business, yeah. Taking care of business every day, as the old song goes. And of course, and then, as we said before, so when you talk about the bullying and so on, as much as a lot of my work has to do with psychology and trauma and how trauma can show up in so many ways, I hesitate to ascribe everything to psychological factors, because I'm seeing this huge systemic historical factors at play here. And
Structural.
yeah. And the other thing that to do with Europe is, of course, what's happening right now over the last several decades. There's been a huge influx of Islamic refugees from countries that the West has destroyed: Ethiopia, Libya, Syria, Palestine, Iran, and so on. And the West It's like the Americans right now. The Americans have devastated Latin America in so many ways historically. They've declared it, as you can see right now. Trump just goes into Venezuela, kidnaps the president, and says, "We're going to take your oil." Well, the Americans have been doing that for 150 years, not as nakedly aggressive in their language, but the so-called Monroe Doctrine, that this is our backyard and nobody else gets to interfere here. And Americans have intervened in Latin America multiple dozens of times in horrendous ways, supporting right-wing dictatorships, mass murder, torture. One could go on forever. And as a result of that devastation in Latin America, there's all these refugees who want to come to North America, which is economically far more promising for them. And they become the enemies that we have to keep out. In other words, the people who are escaping the countries that we've devastated have now become the enemy that we have to keep out of our borders. And in Europe, there's a huge, as far as I can tell from abroad, there's a huge pushback against these Middle Eastern and North African refugees whose countries the West has destroyed. But now these refugees become the enemy and they're taking over and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's another stream that flows into this river of dishonesty and denial.
No, you can really see that in Europe. It's a bit like those who seem to want to say that history started at October 7. That there is a reluctance. It seemed like, for instance, France has the largest Muslim population in Europe.
Yeah.
And somehow it's impossible to ask where, why are they here? It seems to be like it's just like they landed here magically. And at the same time, I'm struck by something else, which is in France, people are very proud of the sort of the pride of a people like the Corsicans, like Mediterranean islanders are sort of the Cretans in Greece, Corsicans, Sardinians. They're proud people. You don't mess around. And everyone in France and Italy and Greece is proud of that. Like they love to tell stories about this.
Or wasn't Napoleon Corsican?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, famously, he wanted to take. He considered taking, or Mussolini considered taking over Corsica from the French, and he said, "I love the cage, but I don't like the birds. They're too dangerous. They're untamable."
Yeah.
But somehow, as we watch, like, just this daily horror that Palestinians are subjected to, just every video, like, just not even the genocidal stuff. I'm talking about just random settlers walking into a store and just just bashing everything. You see this.
If you read, if you just read Haaretz newspaper, which I read, it's English edition, every day, you know what Torah settlers do? They torture the animals of the Palestinians. They slit the throats of baby sheep in front of their mothers. And then the Palestinians come and try and protect their animals. Then the army shows up to arrest the Palestinians. And Haaretz describes these stories, one story after another. At my Instagram site, I posted a plea from some Israeli mental health workers begging the world to intervene, to stop the settler and idea of violence in the West Bank. These are Israelis begging the world. But you don't hear these Israeli voices in the West. They're just not given venue. It's a small minority, for sure, to be sure, but the very fact that they exist. I mean, in Germany, we still talk about a few Germans who stood up against Hitlerism, and we see them as heroes.
Mhm.
But these modern day heroes, these Israelis who actually, it's quite some risk to themselves, plead with the world to do something to stop the genocidal violence in the West Bank. They're not heeded in the West. They're just like they don't even exist.
Mhm. I'm struck. I mean, you mentioned reading Haaretz, and I occasionally I have a look. I find it fairly difficult, to be honest.
Yeah.
Um,
Why do you find it?
because
Why do you find it difficult?
I find it difficult because it sort of you'll get a sliver of self-awareness here and there,
Yeah.
and then you go back to this just absolute insanity. And the fact that Haaretz is labeled as sort of the, the voice of reason, just like it's such schizophrenia, the titles of Haaretz, it's
Well,
just
you know what? It's true. But within its pages, you'll find certain voices that are totally clear. You know,
no,
most,
absolutely,
so,
absolutely.
and,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
all, and all I'm saying is, if we're going to talk about anti-Semitism, and if we're going to paint critics of Israel with this anti-Semitic brush, just pay attention to the Jewish Israeli voices that are saying the same thing and are saying it very clearly in some cases. I mean, Gary Levy talks about apartheid, he talks about genocide, and his parents were German Jews who escaped Hitler. So be done with this already. Drop this nonsense of anti-Semitism when it comes to pointing out the truth about the Israeli state and its nature. And as far as history starting on October the 7th, well, come on. In the last 15 years, in 2004, if anybody thinks that history started October the 7th, I want to show them a study that came out in 2004 in a psychiatric journal before Hamas even took over power in Gaza. And this journal showed that Palestinian kids were severely traumatized. They wet their beds. They were aggressive towards their parents. They had nightmares. That was 2004. 20 years later, who do you think streamed across Israel, the Israeli border? Those same kids who were traumatized before Hamas. And then you look at all the massacres of Gazans starting in 1956 by the Israeli army. Civilians. These are not in question historically. The mass bombings of Gaza by Israel over the decades, killing hundreds of children in the space of it, nothing is new. So it all started, in Hungarian there's a expression that the fight started when the other guy hit me back.
Yeah. No, well, that sums it up. That
That's
sums it up. I want to go towards to take the conversation to the case of Rima Hassan, who's this French member of Parliament of the European Parliament.
recently denied entry into Canada.
Absolutely, yeah. I saw your son tweet about that.
Yeah.
And so she was arrested a few days later by the French police, summoned by the French police for apology of terrorism for a tweet. This is a new low for the French police. And meanwhile, you have a bill that's going to go through Parliament shortly in France, the
Yeah.
Loi Yadan, that intends to take the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which
Right.
basically equates it with anti-Zionism,
Yeah.
and to criminalize anti-Zionism. So I'd really love you to say to the French people how you, as a Holocaust survivor who has done what you've done and lived what you've lived, what this inspires you.
Disgust. Look, first of all, I balk a bit as me as a Holocaust survivor because being a Holocaust survivor doesn't give me any special expertise. A lot of Holocaust survivors would support that law. So being a Holocaust survivor doesn't give you legitimacy as such. The question is not whether you're a
Fair
survivor.
enough.
The question is not whether you're a survivor. No, it does give me, I would have to say, some personal acquaintanceship with anti-Semitism, which I also experienced as a kid growing up in Hungary. So I know a little bit about anti-Semitism, let me tell you. But it doesn't give me any special expertise. It's a question of what is true and what is not true. And that definition, the International Holocaust Remember Association definition of anti-Semitism, is strictly slander. And it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. There are plenty of laws against racism in all kinds of countries. And anti-Semitism is not any special form of racism. It's racism. It's as vicious as Islamophobia, as any kind of racism at all. Race against, hate against colored people or so-called colored people. So that particular piece of legislation has got nothing to do with protecting people from anti-Semitism. It has to do with protecting the state of Israel for people talking about its real nature, which is that of a racist, apartheid, genocidal, colonialist, oppressive state that, look at this recent law that just passed, where Palestinians who kill
Death penalty.
death penalty. No, you think that's bad enough, but it's even worse than that. Do you know that? Because Palestinians, when they're charged, they're taken to military courts where they don't even get to see the evidence against them. You know what happens in a military court in the West Bank? The Palestinian is charged. He's not allowed to see the people that accuse him. When his lawyer asks for the evidence, the prosecutor will say to the judge, well, that's state secret. And the judge says, okay, well, we can't introduce the evidence. So he can't defend against the charge because he never knows the evidence on which the charge is based on. And then he is condemned. If a Jew is charged, they go through civil courts where there's evidence and evidentiary practice, and defense lawyers get to see the evidence. So even if the law applied equally to, in terms of the death penalty, the Jews and Palestinians, it would still not be fair because of the nature of the trial that they each would have experienced.
The system itself.
But then you see these Israeli ministers drinking champagne and wearing a noose as a badge. I mean, how disgusting can you get? And this is what the French Parliament is going to enshrine as a law. It's almost beyond words. It's almost beyond. And then if you criticize this, and by the way, why shouldn't anybody question the right of Israel to exist? Does anybody, when somebody, as the way it is right now, we're not talking about the Israeli people as a people, we're talking about the state as it's set up. I don't want to see it exist. I don't want to see this colonialist, apartheid, genocidal, military, gonzo state continue. I want to see a free state for all the people that live there, Jews and non-Jews. What's wrong with that? Why should that be a crime to call for that? Any more than does anybody want to see the Vichy France? That Vichy France has a right to exist? I mean, does anybody, does Mussolini's fascista state have the right to exist? Did the Nazi genocidal state have the right to exist? Once people saw its true nature. So why shouldn't people be able to question that and have a conversation about it? So there's nothing anti-Semitic about it, given that within the Jewish community, right from the beginning of Zionism, the same questions were asked. And people like Einstein warned against a Jewish state with its military, and so many other Jews did as well. So if that debate could and did take place within the Jewish communities all those years, Why can't that debate also happen in public without being denounced as anti-Semitic? So the law is nonsensical, it's dictatorial, it's anti-democratic, it's mendacious, hypocritical, and ultimately is designed to maintain Europe's colonial relationship to the Middle East.
Yeah. I'd like your take on this on sort of the. It seems that we are in the midst of the crumbling of the, in a way, what you described as sort of all these colonial entities that have forgotten that they are colonial entities and that they've never really wrestled with their past. It
Yeah.
seems that what we're watching is the unraveling of the most formidable gaslighting operation in the history of mankind in front of us. We see it in the whole sort of the way the West is trying to present the war in Iran. We saw it with the genocide in Gaza. We saw Europeans who had nothing to say about the kidnapping of Maduro, nothing to say about Gaza, nothing to say about Iran, who suddenly were outraged by Trump talking about Greenland the way he did.
Yeah.
It was just so surreal. And there's this guy that I've been interested in. A friend of mine wrote his thesis on the work of Paul-Claude Racanier, who sort of coined the phrase perverse narcissism.
Mm.
And he described it as a sort of a failure in the ability to grieve a certain mythology about oneself. That's how he characterized pathological narcissists, perverse narcissists. My friend wrote a book about, funnily enough, it's called Emmanuel Macron, Perverse Narcissism in Power. And it seems that, what you were alluding to is that, it all goes back to just an inability to grieve the fantasies that the West has been building for centuries about itself and its role in the world.
Well, now hold on.
Okay.
That sounds really nice and intelligent, but it's actually about power. I mean, no colonialists. Well, that's not true. The colonialists, well, I was going to say no colonialists acknowledges themselves as colonialists, but that's not true. When the Jews first came to Palestine, they called themselves colonialists. That's what they called themselves. Now, when we talk about settler colonialism, they're outraged. How can you talk about colonialism? They called themselves colonialists.
Of course, the whole commission. Yeah.
But the belief of the colonialists is always that they're entitled. So what the colonialists will never question is their right to be entitled. So the Europeans that came to North America, they were entitled. The Spanish, the Portuguese that devastated South America, they were entitled, Christians. So the issue for me is entitlement. And as long as it's not failure to grieve anything, it's just entitlement. And what they do fail to grieve is their own vulnerability and their own humanity. So they have to hold on to this sense of power in order not to accept a vulnerable humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as the system is economically and politically invested in a colonial enterprise, and as long as they can win, even temporarily, they're not going to grieve. They're not going to acknowledge their vulnerability. Now, it's true. If you listen to a whole lot of a range of American scholars, they see the American empire in decline. And any empire in decline gets more vicious and more naked in its expressions. And that's what we're seeing now. And which leads to another point. Hannah Arendt, the great German-American Jewish political philosopher, said way back in 1942 that the Zionists are making a huge mistake in aligning themselves with the powers far away and alienating the local population. Now, there was truth and lack of truth in that. In that, it wasn't a mistake on the part of Zionism. That's the only way they could have prevailed. So she's telling them, basically, don't do what you're doing. But she's also right in the sense that what happens when those foreign powers wane? Now, the American empire is on the wane. Whether it's got another few years or a few decades, it's on the way out. Then what for Israel? Israel is nothing. Israel is a country of 7 million Jews in the Middle East, living in relative comfort because of the Western buttressing of its economic and military establishment. But they've puffed themselves up. They think they're so powerful. But it's like a frog that has puffed itself up. It's going to burst. Mm-hmm. And what happens to Israel and the Zionist project when America either says, okay, we've had enough of it, we don't need this anymore, or the American empire simply loses its capacity to impose its will on the world? Then what's going to happen to Zionism? Oh, yeah. So from every angle, Zionism is a self-defeating project. And every day they dig their grave a little bit deeper and a little bit faster, and they don't realize it. And there's that ancient Greek expression, those whom the gods would destroy, they first make proud. That's what we're seeing now. And to my fellow Jews, I can only say, you think you're supporting your people? You think you're and securing your future? You're actually destroying it. Not to mention, and I don't know what this is like in France, in North America, there's a tremendous pushback against anybody that speaks out for Palestinians. It's Stalinist in its intent, and it's Stalinist in its tactics. Fire people, if possible, prosecute them, delegitimize them. It's Stalinism, pure and simple. And a lot of people are intimidated, but people don't like being intimidated. They resent it. I'm sure there's a lot of people in Europe who are kind of keeping quiet, but who are really resenting what's being done to suppress critics of Zionism. That resentment at some point is going to explode. People don't like being coerced. And we might see some very vigorous expressions of that resentment once the lid is off.
Of course.
And the lid cannot be kept on forever. It cannot be.
And the great paradox is that laws like the ones that the loi Yadan, which is about to go through Parliament, is actually a vector of anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
Ultimately.
Exactly. And there's been studies, by the way, that have shown, not recently, but over time, that anti-Semitism rises when the Israeli army goes into action. And then as I say, that's because Jews are not allowed to defend themselves. No, that's because people didn't get to see the true nature of the Israeli state. And by the way, even what is called anti-Semitism, I mean, who gets to define that? And but the fact is, if you read Haaretz and other sources, it's not so much admirable to be an Israeli anymore when you travel the world. People don't like you very much. Why don't they like you? Well, because of what you're doing, or at least what your country's doing. It might not be fair to identify every Israeli with what their country's doing, but on the whole, most of them support it. And not only that, the Jewish communities, like this article I referred to in the New Yorker today, when a synagogue puts Israeli flags up and says, we stand with Israel,
of course,
and we're doing this in the name of the Jews, then what are people supposed to think of the Jews?
Of course.
When there's starvation being imposed, when doctors are being tortured to death, when hospitals are destroyed, when universities are devastated, when journalists are targeted, when people are raped and tortured in prisons, when Palestinians in Israeli jails die of starvation, which they do, and the world does see this happening, and this is in the name of the Jews, then what are people supposed to think of the Jews?
Of course.
The truth is, there's no the Jews. There's some Jews, but they're the dominant ones right now in informing the discourse. Or what is the world supposed to think?
How I mean, it reminds me of I remember seeing Norm Finkelstein being asked about the death to the Jews being written on the Houthi
Yeah,
flag. And he
yeah,
says, well, they see people with the Star of David on their flag killing
yeah.
Palestinians day in, day out for the last 80 years. You know, I mean, what
But
do
you
you
know,
expect?
you know what's interesting, by the way? The Star of David has nothing to do with David. You know where it comes from?
I do not.
The same place that the swastika came from,
Mm.
India.
Wow.
Now in India, the swastika turned the other way was actually a symbol for truth and justice, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Star of David, I forget its exact provenance, but it also was an Indian symbol.
Mhm.
You know, so nothing to do with David. You know, but you're right. I mean, when Palestinians have said this to me, when you grow up all your lives and the Jews are all wear uniforms who beat up your parents, what are you supposed to think of the Jews? And some Palestinians found it surprising to meet Jews who were not in uniform, who were not anti-Palestinian. But they grow up with that because it's being done in the name of the Jews and the Jewish people.
Mhm.
So,
Sorry.
no,
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 I have two more questions before I let you go, Gabor, and thank you again for your time.
sure.
First is, as a Jew, you know, earlier on, the reason that for me it was important to say as a Holocaust survivor is because um, I think it's in France, people need to, and in Europe, let's say, people need to hear that. But
Sure.
I get your point that it's sort of irrelevant in terms of your argument.
Yeah.
But as a Jew, I am sure that you are being castigated to some extent by a large portion of your community as someone who has a voice and who is loudly speaking up for Palestinian rights and the Palestinian people. What would you say to Jews in France who are appalled and are struggling to come out and speak up the way you do?
Well, so first of all, I'm used to it. I've been doing it for decades because it was in 1967, after the war, that I did the research and I saw that the history I'd been taught was so one-sided and so biased. And I wrote an article then for the student newspaper at the university, which I attended, in which I said that Israel fomented this war to capture territory that they'll never give back. I said that in 1967. So far, I haven't been proven wrong yet, you know.
Yeah.
Little did I imagine the horrors that would happen, but I knew. So ever since then, I'm used to being critiqued and shunned. Doesn't bother me. It's just the cost of speaking the truth. If you look at French history, and going back to the Dreyfus affair, look at Émile Zola and his famous public letter, J'accuse. He had to leave France. For a while, he had to go into exile. People don't like the truth being spoken. People who identify with the French state don't like that state being exposed for the racist and dishonest institution that it was.
Mhm.
And the great
But it is.
and the great French military was willing to sacrifice one of its members on the altar of chauvinism.
Mhm.
And so people that speak the truth, as somebody said, if you're going to speak the truth, you should keep your horse saddled. So I'm, and of course, what they can't do is argue. I mean, they can't actually argue history because everything I'm saying has been proven and overproven and documented a zillion times over by Jewish Israeli historians. Anybody can read that. Anybody can do that research. It takes nothing. Let me say one more thing, by the way.
By all means.
Albert Speer, the Hitler's economist and architect, spent 20 years in Spandau as a worker mill, as he deserved to do. But in his memoirs, he said, people keep asking me, what did you know? And he said, that's not the right question. This is the right question is, what could I have known? And he describes a couple of incidents where he had hints about what was going on in the East, but he didn't want to find out.
Yeah.
The difference is that in Nazi Germany, they really tried to keep it a secret. And there wasn't the so-called free press, and there certainly wasn't internet and social media. But even then, Speer says, I could have known if I'd wanted to.
That's exactly my grandfather was German. He said the same thing. He said we didn't want to know. We just kept using these euphemisms. The horrible things happening in the East, and just people got away with murder.
Well, today, it's much easier to know. I mean, if you read Le Monde International, it's in there. Not as clearly as one might like it, but it's in there. If you read the New York Review of Books, they talk about the genocide. If you read, if you follow social media, if you follow the alternative news sources, the information, if you listen to what Israelis themselves are saying, it's available. Anybody that today doesn't know, it's you have to work very hard not to know.
So I hear you, and I took note several times during this interview of your reluctance to sort of psychologize everything, and I hear you.
Yeah.
But this will be my final question. There's and it is one last attempt at some form of psycholization, I guess.
Okay.
But
Right.
I'm curious to hear what you think. So, as you know, Carl Jung described sort of he described addiction as a misguided attempt to fill the hole left by spirituality with the spirits,
Yeah.
with alcohol.
It's horseshit.
Okay. Fair enough.
But you never dealt with trauma. So you spiritualize things.
Fair enough.
And you talk about the shadow. Look,
Yeah.
Freud and Jung had some deep insights, but they were also really limited in their perspective. And Freud and Jung spiritualized things rather than dealing with, we all have the shadow. What is that shadow? It's trauma-based. So the addiction is not some need to fill a spiritual need. The addiction is very literally an attempt to soothe the pain of trauma. And that's my work on trauma, which is in my book on trauma. It's in a couple of books. So what Jung calls a spiritual void is actually a deep wound of trauma, a pain that people are trying to soothe through their addictions.
Still, I fair enough on that. But I want to ask about there's another guy that I find very interesting, who's much less known than Jung, whose name is Jacques Ellul. Sort of
the name. I don't know.
Weird. He's a weird Christian anarchist type, strange dude. But he came up with this idea. He wrote a book about propaganda long before Chomsky and others. And he argued that propaganda was not merely manipulation, which is the part that is very obvious, which is the control, the power, the structural, that side. He said it also like one of the ways that one of the things that explains the fact that some people are still want to believe a certain story is because they crave that story, that they, so I guess what I'm trying to say is he saw propaganda not merely as a political phenomenon, but as a sociological phenomenon, as something that, and so don't you think that is part of the answer of why some people, just despite all the evidence, are still latching on to this idea that no, genocide is not the right word and blah, 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 blah?
Sure. So I don't want to I don't want to dismiss psychology as irrelevant to the situation. I don't. I just resist using that as the main explanation.
Fair
But of course, everything in human life has got its psychological dimension. So does this. So if you look at the ancient Hindu view of the mind, it's got these different dynamics. There is manas, which is our memories, conscious and unconscious, and there is sattva, which is our capacity for awareness, this buddhi, which is our capacity for discernment. Then there's what they call ahamkara. Aham means I, and kara means maker. So the ahamkara is our ego. It's our identity. It's our deepest identity.
Mhm.
And that identity drives all the others. So there's a lot of people who are perfectly intelligent, intellectually endowed, but whose identity is caught up in a certain view of themselves unconsciously. That intellect will become a servant to their identity. And that's where propaganda comes into it, is it feeds people's identities. It justifies this identity. It makes them comfortable with that unconscious identification. No, yes, it's a manipulation. It's a very deliberate and conscious manipulation. I mean, Goebbels was very clear on that.
And his teacher, Edward Bernays.
Yeah, that's right.
The double nephew of Sigmund Freud.
That's right. So yeah, there's certainly that aspect to it. It serves the identification, so that the propaganda falls on fertile soil. I mean, the Jews needed to identify as victims, entitled victims. Hitler comes along, and his propaganda fell on fertile soil. So the same thing today. So in France, the French invented liberty, equality, and brotherhood.
Yeah.
They see themselves as fighters for freedom and justice, and of course, in some ways, they have been. But if that's what they identify with, they're not going to look at their colonial past with any kind of clarity, or their colonial present, for that matter. No, we're the representatives of human freedom.
Yeah.
So it's identification then that propaganda, which is on a psychological level, that then political propaganda exploits and finds a home for. I hope that answers your question. By the way, as we're speaking, today's edition of Haaretz arrived, and it says, Jerusalem demolishes home for construction violations if they're Palestinian.
Yeah.
Every day you get this.
Yeah.
Imagine they just show up and bulldoze your home.
Mhm.
Palestinian.
And
in your home city.
Yeah. And the New York Times is in one of those stolen homes in Jerusalem, by the way.
Is that right? Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised.
So bought by the paper from its star columnist Tom Friedman.
Oh, really?
Wow. That's how they roll.
There's a special hell of Friedman will fry, I think, for a long time. For all his honesty and his
absolutely,
and his self-willful, it's a willful blindness that he's got. It's hard to explain.
So there you go. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree. I don't dismiss. Look, even when it comes to Nazism, you can't dismiss the psychology of Hitler.
Of course.
But the psychology by itself would not have created.
Yeah. No, I get the distinction, and it's important, especially for people like me who want to over psychologize. Gabor Mate, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Felix, it's a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for the conversation.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Good night.